Recently on Twitter, a keyboard critic told me that I needed to stay in my lane, specifically Kenner Star Wars toys, and leave anything regarding World War II history to experienced enthusiasts such as himself. On social media, it's easy to silo internet personalities into narrow lanes and then expect them to stay there. But real life isn't so simple. We're more than the sum of our social media profiles, and many of us have varied interests far beyond what people see on the internet. My personal bucket list of life goals has little to do with toy collecting. While I enjoy toys and Generation X nostalgia, these become springboards into my passions for heroes and history. I don't like to live vicariously. My interests tend to inspire me to learn and experience. For example, Indiana Jones made me curious about biblical archaeology and compelled me to train to use a bullwhip in real life. As fun as the movie is, I could honestly care less about fictional golden idols. My biggest passion is World War II history, and if this Twitter critic had paid attention, he wouldn't have used Star Wars as a differentiator from the subject of World War II. It's well known that the original Star Wars movie is a cinematic parable of World War II. The fascist uniformity of the Imperial stormtroopers, the dissolution of the Old Republic by a supreme emperor, and the use of lightning war tactics to destroy their enemies was all very deliberately crafted by George Lucas. Holding out against this empire is a small group of brave but outnumbered rebels who refuse to surrender. They are in the process of trying to bring reluctant new allies to their cause, but at this moment know their victory is a long way off. For now, they fight merely to survive. If this doesn't sound oddly familiar to something in our real past, allow me to take you on a brief journey to discover the real Luke Skywalker, the inspirations for the rebel fighter groups, and how I ended up taking a flight in history's actual X-Wing fighter. I grew up watching World War II movies right alongside Star Wars and Indiana Jones. My father liked the set-piece films, such as The Longest Day, Patton, and The Great Escape. Spectacle films like these, including my much-loved Battle of Britain, give a wide view, as if you're looking down onto a big map. They help you get familiar with the sequence of events, but I find that 1960s style of grandiose filmmaking often keeps the viewer at a distance. If you were to ask me to pick my absolute favorite World War II films or TV shows that depict the events of the European conflict, I'd list Darkest Hour, Colditz, 12 O'Clock High, and Band of Brothers as the best World War II dramatizations for my money. They put you in the rain, so to speak. The tension in these productions and the sense of the odds that the world was up against is expertly done. When my family moved to Great Britain in 1990, my knowledge of World War II was largely limited to the spectacle films I mentioned. But overnight, the relics of the war were all around me, from the Imperial War Museum to the beaches of Normandy to a small airfield called Bassingbourn. Up until that point, I'd been exposed mainly to the acts of the U.S. forces in World War II, things like Omaha Beach and the 8th Air Force. That was the limit of my experience when I decided to do my Eagle Scout project at Bassingbourn Air Tower, the site of the airbase in World War II that the famous Memphis Belle called home in 1942 and 43. Every weekend, I would be up early in the foggy, cold mornings at the air tower with the passionate old men who acted as caretakers of the Tower Museum. They'd tell me stories about being kids during the Blitz. We'd find an air raid siren in the storage closet, and they'd crank the handle and send the RAF guards at the airbase into confusion, and then they'd laugh and laugh. When the radio room was restored, the pilot of the Memphis Belle himself flew over from the United States for the 50th anniversary of the Belle's 25th mission. He gave me my Eagle Scout medal that day, so you can imagine my esteem for the American effort in World War II was quite high. In college, my reading habits shifted from fiction to history, and somewhere along the way I picked up a copy of Duel of Eagles by Peter Townsend. On the cover was a banking Spitfire, a fighter I'd seen fly at Duxford as a kid. I knew of the Battle of Britain, but until this point I'd merely known the basics. Reading Townsend's book sent me into a whole new world of fascination with World War II. I became obsessed with the history of the Royal Air Force. As I said, the allure of courage in the face of insurmountable odds always appealed to me. It's why the story of the Memphis Belle and the less advanced B-17Fs grabs my attention more than the late war dominance of the perfected B-17G. The Battle of Britain just after the narrow escape at Dunkirk with a nation that stood all but alone against a seemingly unstoppable army of invaders was something that was instantly addicting to research. I read book after book after book. Doing so proved to be the key that unlocked everything I'd seen in World War II entertainment up until that point. James Garner's character in The Great Escape being an Eagle Squadron pilot suddenly made sense. The knowledge that The Great Escape itself had been planned and executed by the British came as no surprise. Richard Burton's poignant cameo in The Longest Day suddenly held massive amounts of additional meaning and context. Then I saw the RAF battle dress uniform, and I realized I'd come home. A waist-fitted jacket with braced pants and boots worn over the pants legs with a pistol belt. Remind you of anything? Luke was also a volunteer they assigned a fighter quickly because the rebellion was so desperate for pilots, not dissimilar to the volunteer pilots from other nations in the Battle of Britain, including the Polish, Czech, French, and Americans, outnumbered as much as 4-1 at times throughout the course of the summer of 1940. The pilots of the RAF and the resolute leaders on the ground faced the enemy with their backs to the sea. There was no retreat, only a line to hold at all costs. Between the many books I devoured and the countless movies I absorbed over the next 15 years, the Supermarine Spitfire became the ultimate fighter plane in my eyes, and the RAF some of history's greatest heroes. At this point, I can hear some of you saying, well, Michael, I heard that the X-Wing was inspired by the P-51, or I heard it was inspired by a hot rod sports car. Those are mere aesthetic inspirations. The question I pose is, what is the X-Wing fighter contextually in Star Wars? In the context of Star Wars, the X-Wing fighter is a slightly outdated stunt fighter.
Pardon me for asking, sir, but what good are snub fighters going to be against that?
The Spitfire's origins are with the Supermarine S5, a stunt fighter. In Star Wars, the X-Wing is one of the two mainstays of their fighter squadrons, which also includes the outdated Y-Wing, which can be seen as the Hawker Hurricane, which was a slightly inferior technological platform to the Spitfire. In the context of the Battle of Yavin, you have the rebels in a room not unlike RAF Uxbridge, tracking the battle as it happens. And you have the looming threat of the Death Star, not unlike Fortress Europe. Like the RAF in 1940, the rebels are using the few fighters they have to try and stave off a massive invasion fleet. And just like the Battle of Britain, the leader of that invasion fleet was overconfident and was convinced that they had the upper hand.
Evacuate? In our moment of triumph? I think you overestimate their chances.
Regardless of what literal aesthetic choices were infused into the X-Wing fighter by the filmmakers, the role the X-Wing plays in the mythology of Star Wars is literally that of the Supermarine Spitfire. The real Luke Skywalker could have been any one of those volunteer pilots from other nations trying to help Britain fend off the Third Reich. I became particularly fixated on Arthur Donahue, an American volunteer in the Battle of Britain who stayed with the RAF even after the US officially entered the war 18 months later. He survived the Battle of Britain only to be put in an Eagle Squadron, but he demanded to be reassigned back to an active combat squadron and was sent to Singapore. Upon his return to England, he became the first American to command a British fighter squadron. He died over the Channel while on patrol in 1942. The day before the flight, we'd visited the Battle of Britain Memorial on the Thames, so I could find Donahue's name on the list of the few. Melinda and my family know of my reverence for the RAF and the Battle of Britain, and so in the run-up to our family vacation in England, they arranged for me to have an hour-long flight in a surviving wartime Spitfire. In the days leading up to the flight, we visited RAF Uxbridge, the location of the preserved bunker where they coordinated the battle in 1940. And I returned to the Churchill War Rooms in London to see it once again before taking to the air. The Spitfire was operated out of Biggin Hill, one of the original Battle of Britain airfields. The day would be September 15th, Battle of Britain Day itself. The time would be between 10 and 11 a.m., when the fighting that day began in the skies over England. And coincidentally, the day of the week would be Sunday, the same day as it had occurred on the calendar in 1940. First, we were taken on a tour of the Biggin Hill Restoration Facility, where they restore Spitfire aircraft professionally for customers. Then in their heritage hangar, we were treated to their jaw-dropping collection of warbirds, including airworthy examples of the now rare Hawker Hurricane, the Spitfire's comrade during the Battle of Britain, and the extremely rare Messerschmitt 109E, the early variant of the 109 that fought against the British in the summer of 1940. Amongst these gems were their many Spitfires, including the one I would be flying in, MJ772, a 1943 Spitfire that flew 50 missions in World War II, including multiple missions on D-Day. Officially converted after World War II into a two-seat trainer for the Irish Air Corps, this Spitfire was waiting for me to complete my safety briefing and get suited up in a flight suit and gloves. It was a bright late summer day, not unlike the summer of 1940. As one author coined it, a summer bright and terrible. Underneath the flight suit, I wore my RAF battle jacket that I acquired in 2004, shortly after reading Duel of Eagles. I'd flown in vintage warbirds before. I had a T-6 Texan, a B-25 Mitchell, and 2 B-17 Flying Fortresses to my credit. But this was something truly different. This was the fighter plane that held the line when the margin was at its narrowest. We were heading out to Dover, to the iconic White Cliffs, a site that so many Allied pilots knew meant safety during the war.
Are you excited?
Yeah, I'm
Are you
excited.
nervous?
Yeah, I'm nervous, but in a good way. The ground crew went through the safety procedure with me once more as I was strapped into my parachute and flight helmet. Half of my thoughts were on soaking in the experience. The other half of my thoughts were on what decisions I would make if the Spitfire experienced some kind of engine failure. The pilot, Jez, verified that the person-to-person radio was operating. And then that Merlin engine fired up. I was blown away by how formidable the propeller of the Spitfire was as I stared through it. This was the office for so many combat pilots in the summer of 1940. We taxied to the start of the runway, and before I knew it, the Merlin roared to life. The Spitfire lifted effortlessly off the ground and into the sky. A few moments later, the countryside of England spread out below us. This was where it all happened almost 80 years ago. This was where Britain said, "No, we will not negotiate and we will not surrender." I didn't really know how to feel the entire flight. It was a mix of elation, disbelief, and a sobering first-hand sensation of just a fraction of what it must have been like to scramble into these airplanes and head toward the enemy at almost 400 miles an hour, with only 16 seconds of ammunition between you and anything the Third Reich had sent over that day. When Jez reached the coast, I looked over and saw Dover Castle and the Battle of Britain Memorial. The visibility was so clear, we could see France across the channel. As the Spitfire banked and patrolled north up the coast, I considered for the better part of 80 years, Spitfires have never ceased to soar over the White Cliffs of England. And just as I had that thought, Jez put the Spitfire into a victory roll over the channel. I'd read many times about how exhausting it was to jump into these planes multiple times a day and fly countless sorties, even without engaging the enemy. As we turned to head back across the Kent countryside to Biggin Hill, I confess I felt a little bit of that exhaustion. I was thrilled to be in a Spitfire on Battle of Britain Day, but I also had a twinge of fatigue. I can't speak for others, but for me, that first flight in a Spitfire had my muscles and nerves and adrenaline on a high I didn't realize until after we'd headed inland again. The knowledge that the flight was heading to a conclusion sapped the energy from me a bit. And then this happened. Jez took a diving turn away from something. I wasn't ready for it, and my head was pressed downward by the G-forces that hit us. When Jez leveled out the Spitfire, he told me that we'd been jumped by another Spitfire. Was he serious? I hadn't seen anything, but the footage bore it out. Jez said he'd never had that happen to him before in all of his years of flying Spitfires. Clearly, a Spitfire from another airfield on Battle of Britain Day decided to have some fun with us. On the final leg back to Biggin Hill, all that occupied my mind was how on earth the RAF pilots had done those same sudden maneuvers over and over again at twice the speed or more, with bullets flying all around them. I'd just been given the faintest taste of combat in a Spitfire. Melinda had been right when she told me months ago that it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity I could not allow to pass me by. As we left Biggin Hill for a local pub to have lunch, I knew I'd been given a unique gift with some unbelievable surprises. I thought about Art Donahue, how he was never found over the channel after he was shot down, just shy of 2 years after surviving the Battle of Britain. This was a man who risked loss of citizenship to protect humanity, to do something greater than his individual wants or needs. I hope this event in history will always be remembered. I hope we don't forget.